Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is from Metzia Samachay. Daf Yomi is dedicated to a Shmira for Am Yisrael, Atzoa for the Shvuyim, Yeshua, and the Chayalim. We're going to start on Samachay Amid Aleph 65a, 6 lines from the top. It says Abaye, Amar Abaye, Haiman Demasik Zuzi Deribte Bechavre, a person who makes a claim for interest against his friend. And we know that's obviously prohibited, but he makes a claim. The going price was 4 seah of wheat for a zuz. That's how much the person owed him as interest. And that's what it was going for. Arba grive zuzi bezuza beshuka. But the guy was paying him back, threw in an extra, he gave him a discount. He gave him 5 seah for a zuz. So he owed him 4 as interest, but he gave him 5. Now, because we pass on like Rebbe Lazar, who says that you have to return the ribbis ketzutza, the biblical interest, when we take back the money, arba mafkina mine, idach ozuehu dekomozo gabe. Abai says we only make him pay back 4. The 5th one, that was just the discount the guy gave him. That wasn't part of the interest. So we don't make him return it. Rava says no. Chamisha mafkina mine. No, we make him return all 5. The Meikara B'Toras Ribise Asayl because he got it under the rubric in the context of interest. Second case, Samar Abaya, Haiman Demasik Arba Zuzi the Ribse B'Chav, right? You have like Glima Begavayo. Abaya says this person who owes his friend, for zuzim of interest. Instead of giving him the interest, he gave him a glima, a coat. When we make him give back the coat, because it's interest, we make him give back the interest, we only make him give back 4, but we don't make him glima lo mafkinamine. We don't make him give back the actual coat. We just make him give back the value of the coat, but not the actual coat. Rava says glima mafkinamine. Don't make him return the actual coat. My time. We don't want him walking around saying, and people saying, oh, that's the coat he got because he had money. He was a loan shark, and that's how he got the coat. Because this will be will be cheapening the prohibition of interest. Meaning to say there's a prohibition of interest, and we don't want people saying, oh, he doesn't obey it. Because once something happens, I actually didn't see this in any of the commentaries, but this is my thinking. Once you see one type of sin being committed, it lays the groundwork for that other people to commit that same type of sin. Sin is contagious, and so therefore there we're not going to allow him to keep the coat. We make him return the coat. That's what Rava says. Amar Abaye, Haiman Demasik Tracer Zuzit Ripte V'Chav, right? Rava says the person who makes a claim for, he says to his friend, you owe me 12 zuzim as interest. And he says, you owe me 12. And now the borrower, the guy who owes him, or quote unquote, said he was going to pay him the interest, rents him a courtyard that typically rents for 10. But instead, he says, instead of me paying you the interest, which is 12, I'm going to give you this courtyard, which is 10, for the value of 12. Meaning to say, he overcharges him for the courtyard in order to cover his interest fee. Kimafkina mine, when we make the person who lent him the money, when we make him return it, tracer mafkina mine, we make him return 12, not 10, the value of 12, because that's what he accepted it for. He accepted it for 12 and not 10. And I'm like, Ravina, why? Why? Why don't we say that the person who lent the money initially, why doesn't he claim, listen, when I took it for the price of 12, because it was all profit for me. And so, but now that it's not a profit, I have to return the money, I should really only have to pay by the price that everybody pays. So the Gemara explains, no, Mishum the Amore Savras for Kiblis. No, because the Gemara says we don't allow him to say that because you accepted it for 12, that means that its value is 12, and that's what we make you pay back. The next Mishnah states, Marben al asfar, ve marben al mecher. That if somebody does a rental property, we could be marbe al that. What does that mean? That means we could say to him, okay, the price is $1,000 a month for the year, but if you pay me all of the money up front, you only have to pay me 10,000 and not 12,000. Marben al aslar, you can do that for rental. Ve marben al mecher. You can't do that for a sale. Now you can say the price is $1,000,000, but you pay me up front, you get it for 900,000. You can't do that, as the Mishnah explains. Kate said, "His kiro as chatzero." Let's say rents him a courtyard. Says to him, if you give it to me from right now, he says, if you give it to me from now, then you can have it for 10 selah l'shana. Then if you give it to me from now, you're going to get it for 10 selah for the year. And if you're going to pay me every month, then selah chodesh, then you're going to have to pay me one selah a month, which is 12. That would be permitted. But let's say he sells him his field. He says, if you give me it all now, it's 1,000. But if you give it to me at the end of the year, it's going to be 12, meaning to say 1,200. That's us, or that's prohibited. So the Gemara says, well, why with a sale are you allowed to give a discount if he pays early? Why with a rental are you allowed to give a discount if he pays early? Whereas with a sale, we say that it's interest. What's the difference? So Rabbi Rav Yossi Tamri Travayu, it's because their answer is because the rental property, the money's only due at the end. So this person, he's paying early. It was not yet time to pay it. So therefore, it's lav agar natarei. This is agar natarei, is the agar, the payment is natar, is keeping it with him. Meaning, say you're paying money for keeping the money with you. That's not what's going on here because he doesn't owe the money yet. So here, what he's doing is he's giving him a discount so he doesn't have to track him down and make him pay the money. So therefore, mishvahu so since lav agar natar, right? So since we're saying this is not a case of where he's paying extra for keeping the money with him, but rather mashvahu da achishavya. But rather, this is the true price. Meaning to say the higher price is the true price. And when he says to him, if you give it to me now, if you give it to me now, it'll be for you for 10 selah for the year. He's just giving him a discount. But seifa, but in the case of the sale, since it's a sale, he wants the money right away. Therefore, he's saying you're paying me more money for keeping the money with you. And that's going to be prohibited. Amarava, Dakuba Rabbana Milsa, Rabba said, in fact, the rabbis found the verse for this. It says, Kislir Shana B'Shana. It says, by rental, like a rental for 1 year, a year, means to say, Slir Shal Shana Zu Eina Mishtalemes El B'Shana Acheres. Says the rental for this year is paid next year. So we see that the rental is paid at the end. Then it said in our Mishnah, Imul Gorem B'Shnei Masarmana Asar. He said, if it's coming to be a sale, and you said, if you pay me now, it's 1,000. If you pay me at the end of the year, it's 1,200. That's prohibited. So in this context, Rav Nachman says Tarsha is shari. What's Tarsha? The Ritva says Tarsha is like deaf, meaning to say that something is occluded, that something is not explicit. So a type of interest that's not explicit is permitted. And Rashi explains what this means, because the Gemara here doesn't spell out the cases. So Rashi tells us these cases. Rashi doesn't tell us exactly how he knows what they're talking about, but Rashi says that what we're talking about here is where you're saying if you pay this price for it, the going price for something would be one thing if you pay me now, but if you pay me like you're selling it to me on credit, but if you pay it to me in 3 months, it'll be more money. So why is that permitted? Because you're not explicit about it, and there's not necessarily a fixed price for it. So therefore, in that case, therefore, Rav Nachman says it's permitted. So Eitzrei Rami Bar Chama Rav Nachman, Rami Rav Ukva Bar Chama Rav Nachman. But what about our Mishnah? It says Zimul Goram B'Shnei Masar Mana also that it says that you're not allowed to do it for charge at 1,200. That's prohibited. He says Amalei Hasam Katzlei Hachol Katzlei. In our Mishnah, they were explicit. They were explicit about the price and the distinction: paying now, pay later. But here in this case, they weren't explicit. Amar Papa. Tarsha Didi Shari. In the next case, Rav Papa says, my kind of Tarsha is permitted. What is Rav Papa's Tarsha? Here, the Gemara is a little bit more explicit. My timer. Shachri lo pasid. So he says, because my beer is not going to go bad, and Zuzi lo tzarichna. And I don't need the money. I'm the one who's doing a favor for the purchaser. So now we know the case. The case of Rav Papa is Rashi says Rav Papa he used to brew beer, and he would say that there was a price. There was, typically speaking, a price for the beer if you in Tishrei, and a price for the beer later on in Nisan. And Rav Papa would say to the person who wants the beer in Tishrei, okay, you could pay me in Nisan. You can get the beer now and pay me for the price in Nisan and pay me in Nisan. So that's going to be permitted because Rav Papa is saying, my beer is not going to go bad. I could sell it in Nisan. I don't have to sell right now. And I don't need the money. So therefore, I'm doing you a favor by giving you the beer now. Pay me the price that I'm going to sell it for in Nisan. But when Rav Papa said this, Rav Sheshes prayed Rav Vidi said to Rav Papa, you're only looking at it from your perspective. From your perspective, you're saying you're not charging interest. But Zil Basar Didayo, look at the perspective of the purchaser. If he had the money, he would have bought it at the price in Tishrei, and he wouldn't have to pay Nisan prices. Now that he has no money, he has to pay it. He has to pay the more expensive price. So he is losing money. He is paying interest, even though you don't think you're gaining interest. So the third case of Tarsha is Rav Chama, Amar Rav Chama, Tarsha Didi, Vadai Shari. He says, my Tarsha is for sure permitted. Again, here, the Gemara doesn't spell out what exactly is the Tarsha, but it's a little bit opaque, but Rashi fills us in. Rashi says what we're talking about is that Rav Chama was somebody who sold pragmatia. He was a merchant. He sold stuff. And what happened was he gave his goods to somebody to sell, but he didn't sell them so basically, let's say he had a collection of pens to sell, and the pens in DC were a cheaper price, but in New York City they're more expensive price. So he gave the pens to the person at the more expensive price. Even though he's in DC, he gave it to him at the New York prices. Then the person goes to New York and sells them and gets money for them. So Rav Chama says that you owe me the amount of money at the New York price, but until you actually sell it, it's really in my possession, meaning to say that I'm the owner of it and I'm responsible for any loss. But once you sell it, that's when it becomes a loan. And so in this way, he was able to evade it's not interest, even though he gave him the value of $20, for example, and now he's giving him back $30, doesn't matter because it was turned from a loan, from a product that he was selling into a loan. And so therefore it's permitted. So that's why Rav Chama says, Tarsha Didi Vadai Shari. My timer, because what would be the problem? The problem would be that these people are working for Rav Chama and they're selling his stuff for him, and he's not paying them. He says, no, but they want that. Why? Because they want it to be considered to be my property and not theirs. Because they don't have to pay the taxes because I'm a rabbi. They have like parsonage. And also, and also they get a little preference in the marketplace. They have certain days that only rabbis are allowed to sell. So therefore, they want it to be under my name. So everybody benefits. And so therefore, he says it works out. The Hilchos like Rav Chama, and the law is like Rav Chama. It's interesting that it's very important to note that the law is like Rav Chama here, and this idea of turning a business into an eventual loan is going to become the basis for the Heter Iska, because Jews throughout the centuries were figuring out more and more complicated ways of trying to work within the Torah's prohibition of interest, and yet not be shut out of commerce and banking. And so this became the origins of a concept called the Heter Iska, which, if you want to see a beautiful article about it or a very small summary, you can look in the back of the volume of the article, and has a page in the appendix on the Heter Iska, which basically converting a loan, a business venture into a loan. And the law is like Rebbe Elazar that we said that if it's ribis ketzutza, if you took actual interest, you have to pay it back. This is about a future sale where you're purchasing a product in the future on the basis that he has the money, he has the product, but he says, Rav Yana said, he doesn't actually have to have the money, the product itself, he could just have the value and it's still okay. Now we're up to the next Mishnah. Machar lo, or in Samachayim Abayis 65b, and what does the Mishnah say? Machar lo as a sadeh. Let's say a person sold somebody his field. V'nasan lo mitzvah stammer. Moving sold the field to Shimon. Shimon, he said he's selling the field for $1 million, and Shimon gave him $100,000 as a down payment. V'amar lo, he says to Reuven, says to Shimon says to Reuven, a masay shetirtza have mos. Reuven says to Shimon, okay, whenever you want, bring the rest of your money, v'tola shalcha, and then take the rest of the field. Aser, that's going to be prohibited. Why is it prohibited? Because we're going to have a problem of interest either way. Because what are you doing with the produce in between? Now, let's say Reuven is eating the property in between, the produce in between, and Shimon then pays him the rest of the money. So in the meantime, he's getting $1 million plus he's getting the produce. So then Reuven is getting the $1 million plus the produce. So now he's getting like interest. But let's say Shimon would not bring the money, then Reuven would have to return let's say Shimon would be the one eating getting the property, and Reuven would return the money plus he'd be giving him the fruits, and that way Shimon would also be the so-called purchase would have been turned into a loan, and he'd be getting the interest in between. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Asar lasoskin." V'davka the Amar way, but Rashi's explaining like this on the basis of the Gemara. It's only going to be when he says chimaisis, when you bring the money, then Mosar Amos Kanami Achshav, that when you bring to me the rest of the money will be purchased by now. Fikach Asar La'asoskein. It's prohibited to do it. So Rashi gives out the two scenarios. Shem Yochal Mochar Peros Betokach, because if the seller is the one who's consuming the fruits, look at Shayavi Zamos, when the buyer brings the rest of the money, then it's going to be that the field was acquired by the purchaser on the day that he gave him the down deposit. And so therefore, the seller was eating the fruits, and it's as though he's getting the money plus the interest for lending him the money. But let's say the purchaser will be eating the fruits from right now. Maybe he's not going to bring the rest of the money, and then the seller will return to him the deposit, and so therefore the field was not purchased to him at all. And so then it's basically being turned, it was like a loan. And so now he's also getting an interest. So that's the case. But let's say a person lends money and he gives his field as a collateral. He says to him, he says to him, if you don't give me the field, he gives him, let's say, $1 million, but he lends him $1 million, and the person gives him his field as a collateral. And he says to him, if you don't give me the money, the $1 million that you borrowed from me by 3 years, then I'm going to keep this field. Harei shelo. Then under those circumstances, even though the field was, let's say, worth $1.2 million, nevertheless, the lender is going to be able to keep the money. And so therefore, it's as though he sold him the field for cheaper. He's going to be able to keep the field as though he sold him for cheaper. Indeed, Baitis Ben Zunin, that is what he did on the basis of the rabbi's direction. So the Gemara says regarding the first case of the Mishnah, that if a person sells a field to his friend and the purchaser collects a down payment only, miyachol peros, who's going to be consuming the produce in the meantime? Ravuna Amar Mochar Ochol Peros. Ravuna says the seller can eat the fruit in the meantime. And Ravanan says Mishal Shenes Peros. You have to put the fruits into escrow. Velo Pligi. And they're not arguing. Hada Amar L'chi Maisis Kani. That the Ravuna who says that he's allowed to eat the rest of the seller is allowed to eat the fruits. That's where he had said to the purchaser, when you bring me the property, that's where you have acquired it. That's where you acquire the field from right now. And so therefore, even if retroactively the purchaser will, meaning to say, the seller says to him, when you bring me the money, from that point on, you'll have acquired it. And so therefore, even though the purchaser will bring the rest of the money, he's only going to buy it from that point on. And so now, at this point, the field still belongs to the seller. And so therefore, the seller still owns the field. He's just waiting for the purchaser to pay him for it. And so therefore, it's permitted for him to eat the produce. That's how Rafuna explained it. Whereas Ravanan says, Ravanan's position is where he says it goes into escrow because he says, he says, actually, once you bring the money, you've acquired it from right now. And so that means retroactively, the purchaser owns the fruits. And so then we have the problem that basically, since he owns it, he's giving the person the fruits, that means it's a form of interest. Tani Rav Safra, Baribas Derebechia. So, as we said, it's not really an argument because Rav Safra taught the Ribas Derebechia. Pa'amim Sheshneim Mutarim. In both cases, sometimes both the seller and the purchaser can eat the fruits. Pa'amim Sheshneim Asurim. Both sometimes the seller and the purchaser cannot. Pa'amim Shamochar Mutar V'Lokeach Asur. Sometimes the seller is permitted and the purchaser is prohibited. Sometimes the purchaser is permitted and the seller is prohibited. And so once he taught this price, Ani Rava Basrei, Rava is going to explain it. Sometimes both of them are permitted. The Amar where he says Kani Kishir Zuzeh, where if he says to him, if the seller says you purchased it according to the amount of the deposit, and so therefore the seller is allowed to keep the parts that weren't sold. Yet, and the purchaser can keep the parts that were sold. And sometimes they're both prohibited. The Amalei that the seller said, meaning retroactively you'll acquire it. So then they both can't eat it because maybe it'll become interest. Sometimes the seller is permitted and the person who's purchasing is prohibited. Because he says when you bring it, you'll acquire from this point on. So the seller owns it, but the purchaser is prohibited because he doesn't own it yet. And if the sale doesn't end up going through and he gets it back, then it'll be like a loan which he's charging interest. And sometimes the purchaser is permitted and the seller is prohibited. Because he says you're going to purchase it from right now. And the money you gave me is a loan. So then the purchaser is going to be permitted to have it because he acquired at that point. And the seller can't have it because, so in that case, the seller is prohibited because he doesn't own it anymore. And if the purchaser doesn't end up buying it, then it's going to turn out to be a loan, which the seller will benefit. And who's the one who says both of them are prohibited? Again, this is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda had said, remember we said the position of Rabbi Yehuda, as long as it's possible that it will not end up in an interest relationship, Rabbi Yehuda allows it. And so since that's always a possibility that it will work out, therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be permitted. So now he said mashkin lo bias or mashkin lo sada. Let's say a person, this is similar to the second case of Mishnah. Let's say a person buys a field, borrows money, and in exchange for the loan, he collateralizes his house or his field. He says, and now if you want to sell it, you have to sell it to me, and you can only sell it to me, and at this inflated price. And then it will be also that'll be prohibited because that is like a form of interest that basically I borrowed $1 million, and when you want to sell it, you can only sell it to me at this inflated price of let's say 1.2 million. So that's interest, but bishavein. But if it's for their exact value and you can only sell it to me, that's permitted. Montana bedamim alo. So who's the one who says with this money it's prohibited for this inflated money? I'm Rafuna Breder Rabbi Yehuda. Look, Rabbi Yehuda. Again, it's not like Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Tzadacha b'Rebbe Smutter. Rabbi Yehuda is of the position that that one side with respect to one possibility is that it's not interest, and only one possibility is interest, that's permitted. Now it said in our Mishnah, Macho Abayas, Macho Osada, V'Amalo Yuli Mos. So the next case of the Bryce says if he sells him a field or a house, and he says, when you have money, return it to me, bring me back the money, Aser. Meaning to say, he says, he sells him his house, he sells him the field, and he says, when you have money, give it back. It means prohibited. But if he says, when you will have the money, I'll bring it back to you, it's permitted. Montana, who is the one who says this? I'm Ravuna Breder of Shua. It's again not like Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda says the same idea. So what's the difference between the first case and the second case? So Rava says the difference is that in the second clause where he says it's permitted, that's where the purchaser was not obligated to return against his will, but rather it says if he wants to sell it back, then he's allowed to, but the seller cannot force him to do it. And so therefore, since there's not a condition that obligates the purchaser to return the house to the seller, so therefore the sale is a valid sale. And so even if the seller will redeem the field, but rather he can go and sell it back. And so therefore it's not a loan and it's not interest. Okay, so we'll stop here. Stop the recording here. And we say to everybody,